Hey everyone, welcome back to 51%'s Crypto Research Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy. Today I'm joined by Daniel Heyman, a co-founder and program director at PegaSys, and Faisal, whose role is strategy and business development at PegaSys. I wanted to have the PegaSys team on for a few reasons. The first is they're one of the largest and most active spokes at ConsenSys, and they're focused on enterprise Ethereum deployments. The team stole the show at DevCon 4 with the release of Pantheon Core, a new Ethereum client like the popular ones Parity and Geth, but this client allows enterprises to more easily interact with the main Ethereum chain. The team also describes their enterprise alpha offering on the podcast, which is set to be released in the first quarter of 2019. The team has invaluable information on the state of private blockchains, the interaction between public and private blockchains, and the overall idea of why enterprises would want to use blockchain technology in the first place. We also discussed competitors or possible competitors, including Hyperledger, AWS with Kaleido, and Microsoft Azure, and even IBM. I will say the PegaSys team is very technical focused, so my goal of this episode was to introduce and educate my listeners on what the team is doing in hopefully a less technical format. As an aside, I wanted to remind our listeners that on 51pct.io, we recently released our latest research report on Ethereum 2.0, or Serenity. We argue why we believe Ethereum Serenity could drive a potential 10 times increase in demand for gas, and increasing scarcity of ETH could drive ETH's price higher. We also disclose that I personally do own Ethereum tokens known as Ether. Listeners can view the report on 51pct.io. With that, here's my conversation with Daniel and Faisal of PegaSys. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined by the PegaSys team. How's it going, guys?
It's going well. Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, Tom.
So Daniel, let's start with you. Tell us about your background and how you got started in crypto.
So my background is a bit meandering. I think like a lot of people in the space, my first job out of college back in the day was working at a research lab at MIT called the Poverty Action Lab, which does microeconomic research on what's effective and what's not effective in trying to make a difference. And so they sent me to live in West Africa first and then East Africa, studying a variety of things, but by the end of it, I was studying the adoption of new technology. And when I was there, Bitcoin, by way of remittances, was just starting to be an idea that was floated around. Mobile banking had already taken off, and a lot of innovation was being built on top of mobile banking, so that sort of piqued my interest. Got engaged, did some research, didn't get too involved, but had been following the space from a distance until a couple of years ago when I shut down my previous startup, and so started looking for opportunities to get actively involved in blockchain. And so that's when I joined ConsenSys.
Interesting. And Faisal, how about you?
Yeah, mine's, I guess, a little less global. I don't know, maybe. So I used to work in consulting, mostly strategy consulting with digital transformation. So either technology companies on their strategy or companies that are looking to expand into digital, and always wanted to sort of work at a tech startup. I, during my MBA, interned with a VC, and this was like sort of early 2016, and blockchain was just getting on their radar. So it was the kind of thing where they would give it to an intern to assess. So I wrote a report on blockchain and sort of didn't think about it for a while. And then about a year and a half later, got introduced to Joe Lubin, was working in Dubai on a project and met him and some of the team. And they were advising the government of Dubai on sort of their blockchain strategy. And it seemed like a really exciting opportunity. So joined over there and worked on our consulting arm for a little less than a year. And then I joined the PegaSys team about 11 months ago, just because I thought what they were doing was really cool. So sort of switched over to that spoke.
Interesting. So let's just get the high level overview of, what PegaSys is and what you guys are trying to do. I don't know who has the best elevator pitch here.
I'll give it a shot. So PegaSys is the protocol engineering group at ConsenSys. So we stand for Protocol Engineering Groups and Systems. And we're trying to build enterprise-grade blockchain technologies for both the public and private use cases. And so what we do in practice is we've built Pantheon, which is an Ethereum mainnet client. And then we build private chain modules on top of that client to make it easy for enterprises to get on and start using this technology.
Interesting. So I guess to preface the point of PegaSys, I guess we have to first talk about why enterprises would want to use blockchain and even interact with the main Ethereum chain. So I guess what's your guys' take on why enterprises would want to use blockchain technology?
I can try on that one. So I think there's been a lot of interest in the space over the last year plus now, and there's a couple of different reasons. I think enterprises first got interested in it for financial services. Obviously, Bitcoin, Ethereum. You have the use cases for people call it digital gold or digital oil, but really any tokenized asset. Whether that's gold or another commodity or real estate, which is another really interesting area that we see a lot. And that's an interesting one because it maps to both the public chain and the private chain use cases. You see stock exchanges or places like DTCC getting interested in looking at tokenized shares and tokenized equities, and then you also see on mainnet people trying to tokenize actual buildings, and it's just very interesting because of sort of the way it breaks down walls, whether that's between enterprises or geographies, to trade an asset across borders or make payments or things like that. At the same time, obviously, that opens up a ton of challenges as well. You can't just move an asset across borders in today's financial system because there's regulation and KYC and all these kinds of things. But yeah, I think on a high level, it's really about tokenization and digital assets is the main draw, and we see a lot of supply chain interest as well. And so that's kind of more traceability, but it's not too far afield from what digital asset use cases.
That's interesting. Yeah, I definitely think it's worth talking about enterprise use cases for blockchain for a bit, just because of before we get into your specifics, just to set the stage. But I feel like over the past year, it's like a tale of two cities. Like the enterprise use case news of blockchain is kind of like falling off a cliff. Like we had IBM and Maersk with supply chain and a bunch of others. But on the flip side of that, we're seeing like the tools for enterprise adoption like becoming much better. Like we're seeing that with Kaleido and AWS and all the frameworks that the cloud providers are rolling out for blockchain. I mean, are you guys seeing the same thing? Like use cases are kind of slowing down, but the tools are getting better?
So I think they're actually growing hand in hand. There was a lot of ideation in the early stage where people were sort of experimenting and maybe testing the limits of what blockchain could be used for, both in theory, but also in practice, given just the real limits of where the state of the technology is today. And what we're seeing now is an increasingly aggressive and exciting set of use cases that are being implemented and going to be rolled out in 2019 or 2020 as is in parallel, companies like Kaleido and AWS with their announcement and so forth make it easier for more and more people to deploy solutions like that.
That's interesting. So I guess one last question on the enterprise blockchain adoption. It seems to me like there's not like any technical bottlenecks, but just like sometimes a cultural bottleneck, like which company of a consortium is going to control the enterprise blockchain. Are you guys seeing like any cultural bottlenecks to enterprise blockchain adoption?
So I think there are both cultural and technological bottlenecks at this point. And so you hit the nail on the head that there's a lot of behavioral change that goes into deploying a production grade blockchain based system at scale. Someone needs to drive that implementation. Usually one member of the consortium needs to drive that implementation, but they need to drive it in such a way where they're setting up an equal and fair network for all participants so they don't have some meaningful advantage. If they do, it undermines a lot of the value proposition that they're bringing to the table. And so getting the right partners with the right mindsets and a sufficient understanding of the technology and the opportunity is going to take time, and there's a process there.
That's interesting. So let's dive into PegaSys. You guys stole the show at DevCon. You released Pantheon. So let's get into it. What's Pantheon and why did you guys develop this?
Sorry, I was on mute. So Pantheon is the newest Ethereum mainnet client. So I don't know how technical your audience is, but to basically connect to Ethereum, you need to download a bit of software called an Ethereum client and run it. And there's two main ones out there, Parity and Geth. And Pantheon is vying to become a third mainnet client. So we built it for a few reasons. So one, more clients means a more healthy ecosystem. You're less dependent on any one team or centralized software provider. So we think more is better. The second is we were looking to do something from the ground up so that we could have it licensed in an enterprise-friendly open source license. So Pantheon is an Apache 2 license, which makes it easier for enterprises to adopt, both on mainnet or private chain. The third reason is we wanted to build something that had a few more abstractions built into it, and so it was more easy to configure and customize for private chain deployments, which will really be the foundation of our enterprise offering that's coming out in Q1 next year. And then the final bit is we wanted to do something in Java. So Geth and Parity are written in Go and Rust respectively, which are awesome, but we wanted a sort of an enterprise-grade client that was out there that spoke an enterprise language, sort of a language that enterprises are really comfortable and familiar with, and that there's a huge community to develop on top of.
That's interesting. So how, I guess for an enterprise, like how much easier is it to interact or use Pantheon versus Parity or Geth? Like, are there specific pain points within the client that you guys address to make it much easier for enterprises?
Yes. So the current version today is a mainnet client, so enterprises can use it, and we have a few that are playing around with it. But the real value, we believe, will come as we open up our enterprise alpha. And so the enterprise alpha is going to layer on a few additional components to the mainnet client. So those components are a private chain consensus algorithm and private chain consensus algorithm and a smart contract-based permissioning layer. But on top of that, if we put aside the technology and sort of the features for a moment, the very fact that we're enterprise grade, that we're written in Java and sort of more likely to make it through InfoSec review, and that we're Apache 2 license, which is an enterprise-friendly license, just removes a bunch of the initial hurdles that some of the other technologies in the space face.
That's interesting. So did you guys produce this client like ahead of issues you foresaw, or do you think that ConsenSys in their dealings with enterprises and business found out that this was something that was needed in the marketplace already? I'm not sure whether you guys are like addressing problems you've seen or trying to solve problems before they pop up for enterprises.
I think it's some combination of both. We did get a lot of feedback from enterprises about the license. It's kind of a non-starter to use GPL open source software at a lot of the sort of large like Fortune 500s. And so the Apache 2 was definitely came from that feedback. And some of the other feedback just in terms of making it more modular, using language that was more production friendly, like Dan mentioned, using Java or other tooling. And then I think thinking for the future, there are some elements that we're trying to build in. So, for example, using approved cryptographic algorithms. So NIST, which is a government agency in the US, has certain standards for cybersecurity on cryptography, and using sort of eligible cryptographic tools for that. It's not something that we have today, but we've tried to design the architecture and the blockchain sort pieces within Pantheon so that you could change those out in the future for more government friendly, or for, sometimes foreign governments don't like to use the US based cryptography. So swapping that out, being able to swap out maybe the database that you're using or things like that. So at this stage, it's more about giving the flexibility, because sort of every enterprise deployment's a little different. And the blockchain is just really one thin layer in the stack, and so you're going to have to work with a lot of different things to make it work in production. And I think that was really the goal.
That's interesting. So to zoom out, the Pantheon client is meant to make it easier for enterprise and businesses to interact with the main Ethereum chain, and then what you're building with Alpha is, let's get into Alpha just to, round everything out. What is the Alpha release going to be, and how does that interplay with the Pantheon client?
So just before answering that question, the long-term vision and thesis that we at PegaSys hold is that enterprises are going to want to interact with the Ethereum mainnet because they're going to be able to benefit and conduct business in new ways through interacting with mainnet. But there's a couple of sort of intermediary steps that we're working towards. So we contributed Pantheon to the mainnet and are making a lot of contributions and research efforts to the Ethereum 2.0 and Serenity work because we know that the mainnet needs to get better. It needs to improve its scalability, some consensus algorithms, its curves that Faisal just talked about. We know all those improvements need to happen before enterprises can adopt mainnet and scale. And so in the interim, we're looking to ease enterprises onto the blockchain paradigm through private deployments, so private networks that they can launch on their own. And so that's what the Enterprise Alpha is going to enable. And so when you talk about private chains, or sort of what some people call the 3 Ps, performance, permissioning, and privacy. And so performance means transactions per second, or sort of the throughput, as well as the stability of the system. And when we launch our alpha, we're going to be launching a new private chain consensus algorithm alongside it that'll greatly improve the performance of private chain networks on Ethereum. Then we're also going to be launching permissioning, which is, we're building a smart contract-based permissioning system. So the networks can dynamically swap in and out and permission nodes to join the network in either different roles or with different rights as members of the network. And then the third bit that we're working in parallel, which won't be part of the alpha release, but we expect to come out soon after, is a privacy layer that enables 2 nodes on a private network to speak and interact confidentially without the rest of the network knowing the contents of their transaction, or even that they've transacted in the first place.
That's a great overview and much needed to round everything out. It is a bit confusing from the outside looking in. So you guys are betting that not only will enterprises want to interact with the main Ethereum chain, but that it's too hard to do now, and you guys want to make it easier. So I guess my other question is on this topic is that a lot of people are kind of betting on public or private chains. In my mind, I feel like there's definitely a battle between the two, and you guys are the first team that I've seen that are taking the middle of the ground that both will survive. So isn't a bet that enterprises will want private chains kind of a bet against public chain scalability? Like, I'm just wondering why enterprises would need like private networks if they could just use the public chain if it's ultra scalable.
So different chains have different use cases, and you can do more customization on a private chain. So the main net will have a limited number of roles and responsibilities, for example. On a private chain, you can have many different types of roles and responsibilities. You can have a regulator node, you can have proposers, validators, be a little bit more detailed in how you splice the system. And so that's one of the attractions of the private chain. Obviously, the public chain comes with its own suite of advantages as well. And so what we're trying to do is build a system that enables enterprises to benefit from private chains when they're appropriate, benefit from public chains when they're appropriate, and then connect the two as needed. So one of our research projects is called Sidechains, right? It's a sidechains research project that is all about making it easy to spin up new sidechains that anchor up and connect to a public mainnet.
That's interesting. So where are the private chains in Enterprise Alpha going to be hosted? Like, does a business have to buy the servers and run it, or is this something that's like spun up on the cloud, or how exactly does that work?
Both. So we're just the software provider. So we will be partnering with Kaleido for people who want to spin it up on AWS through Kaleido. We are also talking to enterprises who want to deploy on-prem.
That's interesting. So currently, I'm assuming that AWS with Kaleido, if a business wants to spin up a blockchain through those tools, through ConsenSys, I'm assuming that there aren't good connections between AWS Kaleido and the Ethereum main chain, because it sounds like that's exactly what you guys are doing, right?
So Kaleido has the ability to anchor to mainnet. So you basically take a snapshot of the network and put that on mainnet so that at least there's a checkpoint that you can see. We're long-term looking for much more two-way communication between mainnet and private chains.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So let's just go into not, I guess, your enterprise competition, I guess. I mean, do you guys feel that you're now competing against AWS, Kaleido, or Hyperledger, or Microsoft Azure Workbench? I'm just trying to get a grasp on like who you guys are up against here.
So those services or providers, a lot of them address different parts of the stack. So with AWS or Azure or Kaleido, I think we see ourselves as sitting on top of that. And you can choose whatever protocol you like with the cloud. And they're just sort of key partners for helping us get into enterprises. For places like Hyperledger, it's interesting. I don't know if we have like a thesis on how things will shake out. They've got EVM projects. They've got IBM's efforts with Fabric. There's Monex and all kinds of other stuff going on, and E is trying to work more closely with them. And so in general, I think we're just trying to collaborate in ways that make sense, and seek out opportunities for interoperability, or where maybe you could see overlaps in tooling or deployment. Like I said, blockchain's a pretty thin layer in the overall enterprise stack, and so if it ends up being sort of a very complicated or Byzantine ecosystem, that's not really good for anybody. And so we want to try and work with others to make sure that it's sort of easy to understand and collaborative.
That's interesting.
Just to echo that a little bit. So the cloud providers, and Microsoft is one of our key partners today with Azure. You can go ahead and find Pantheon on the Azure marketplace, and we're talking to other cloud providers potentially about being there. We see them as key partners in making it as easy as possible to deploy these systems and get the tooling you need to want to deploy these systems. So the ecosystem, particularly the enterprise ecosystem, I think is far too nascent to spend too much time worrying about internal competition at this point. We need to be delivering value to enterprises to grow the ecosystem.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, I guess looking out a few years, do you guys envision that a lot of the data that's currently stored on the cloud will transition to maybe private blockchains or even on the public cloud? It seems like a lot of data on the cloud is probably redundant, and your goal is probably to link all these companies together on, private blockchains that then interact with the public chain.
I mean, Dan, feel free to comment as well, but I would say probably, all that data on the cloud doesn't need to go into a blockchain. Like you're saying, blockchains tend to be redundant a bit. They have distributed copies of the same data a lot of the time. It's more useful for either specific use cases, like what we were mentioning about with digital assets, or at sort of trust points, where enterprises might need to collaborate on something, or where you have multiple systems, like a supply chain use case where someone's got two companies have two different systems and they need to talk to each other and have like a single source of truth. So I don't see, a large scale migration of cloud onto sort of private blockchains. I think it's going to be more creating a way for trustless collaboration or consortium-based collaboration, or for specific uses where it makes sense to have everything on the chain. But I don't know, Dan, if you want to add anything there.
So Ben Horowitz a few months back said something really succinct that I thought was pretty powerful, which is blockchain in many ways is just another database that is worse than all the existing databases except in one way. And that way is that it's trustless. And so a lot of the large scale adoption of blockchain for sort of the use case you just mentioned, Tom, will depend on whether blockchain can innovate and improve quickly enough to overtake databases on these other vectors. But I think even if it doesn't, the new use case that's unlocked, the new business value and the new consortia that are unlocked by having this trustless system, enables a whole suite of enterprise use cases down the road that are really powerful and really exciting.
That's interesting. So I want to get back to the use case, but I just have one more question on this topic. I mean, since you guys are helping businesses run private blockchains, doesn't it like not matter if Ethereum can scale? Like, because it seems like, if you guys have private blockchains for businesses and, occasionally they interact with the main chain by sharing data or storing state or something, doesn't it like not matter if Ethereum, the main chain, scales? It seems like you guys are kind of trying to solve that in a way by taking everything off the main chain. I'm not sure if I understand that correctly, but I'm just wondering your take there.
So I can see why you would say that, given we're working on private chain deployments, but I think that like any network, a blockchain is more useful the more participants you have. I think one of the reasons we like Ethereum so much is that it's proven at a large numbers of nodes. I think at peak Ethereum had like 25,000 nodes running on the mainnet. If you could imagine a use case that had 25,000 companies collaborating or sharing information in some ways, I think that's where you get sort of those internet level additions of value, versus when you're talking about 5 to 10 nodes or 5 to 10 companies, you're talking about very incremental value. And that's why we care about mainnet so much. I think we actually have a 10-person team working on the Ethereum 2.0 effort, and that's going basically in parallel to a lot of the enterprise blockchain work we're doing, because we do see a future for Ethereum where the transactions per second, where the privacy, where all of that is advanced to a much farther state. And so those private chain deployments that we might be working on in 2019, could get mapped back to the mainnet in the way an intranet, joined the internet like 25 years ago. And maybe that's behind some kind of firewall, maybe it's through some kind of off-chain service, but that's sort of the parallel tracks that we're taking. So that's my view. I don't know, Dan, if you have any 2 cents around that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with the internet to internet analogy, right? So a lot of the early value that enterprises saw in the technology that we now call the internet was based on sharing information within their industry or within just their company. And it actually took quite some time for them to get comfortable with the idea of sharing information more broadly or interacting differently with the internet. And I think we'll see that sort of transition happen in blockchain. It's sort of a very natural transition for people to be a little bit more incremental at the beginning before wholesale changes. And so part of our goals with the Enterprise Alpha is to get enterprises more comfortable with blockchain paradigms as a whole to increase their ability to adopt the mainnet one as mainnet scales.
Got it. That's super interesting. And I apologize to the listeners. It's definitely a technical podcast. You guys are the most technical team I've had on so far, I think, but I think you guys are sharing a lot of great information, obviously. So just building on that point, I mean, there's so much going on with Ethereum 2.0 or Serenity or whatever we've decided to call it at this point. I just released a deep dive on it, and it was pretty intensive, and it was an extensive report. But I'm just wondering, like, let's say 5 years from now, Ethereum reaches true scale with plasma and sharding and what have you. Is there still a use case, do you guys see, for enterprise blockchains to interact with the main chain? I mean, obviously for the privacy permissions, privacy you guys have talked about, but I'm just wondering what PegaSys looks like in a world where Ethereum scales.
So I guess 2 parts to that question. So what does PegaSys look like, and what does sort of enterprise blockchain look like? PegaSys, the 3-word motto we use internally is sort of cloud era for blockchain. We want to be an open source provider with a really vibrant community building on top of our software, and then have enterprise grade modules that we can license on top of that for specific use cases. And so it's a classic open source business model that we're really excited to build and get behind. In a world where sort of Ethereum scales, I actually think it's unlikely that Ethereum will ever reach a point where the scaling problem goes away. it's kind of like you can never get to a point where a city's traffic problems go away, because every time you build another road, it just increases the demand of drivers. And so as you increase the capacity of the Ethereum network, that's going to increase the demand to use the network, and we're probably always going to hit the limits at some point. And so we're always going to have that trade-off between when's the right time for public net, when's the right time for private net. But even if that thesis is wrong, even if we hit sort of infinite scalability, the reason you interoperate is there's certain use cases that are better designed behind permissions and some that are inherently more public. And so the permission world, we talked about the value of different roles. Regulations are really important in that. In the public world, you can think of it as the one that I'm most bullish on is sort of certain asset transfers that are free from regulation, or asset transfers that you want to be on the public net that connect to private permissioning, but sort of you benefit from the public visibility, auditability, traceability, and maturity. So there's a lot of different ways to go back and forth and to use both sets of technologies.
That's interesting. So Daniel, just expanding on your last point there, which I think is interesting and worth talking about. I mean, could you walk us through maybe the life cycle or like a potential use case or the interaction between the main chain and a private chain, like what a private blockchain would want to share on the main chain and why?
Absolutely. I'm trying to think what the best one is. So let's see. I think consortium networks are really where a lot of the interesting use case innovation is happening. So, we just had Santander announce that they're going to put a bond on the public net, but Santander and a lot of other banks are exploring consortium-based chains as well. And so in the consortium-based world, you can imagine them sharing information or sharing, information about who's an accredited investor. I'm sure there's regulation against that, but imagine the world where they're sharing that information. That could then buttress their ability to sell that bond more freely on the mainnet, and they would call the private chain where they store this confidential information in a different way.
Got it. That's interesting. So I guess let's just switch gears a little bit. As I said, this is somewhat of a technical podcast episode that I'm trying to make non-technical for our listeners to learn more about you guys. I mean, what has been the greatest pushback or problems that you guys have faced in the space? I mean, whether it be culturally with regard to enterprise blockchain adoption, or whether it be just with PegaSys overall and developing, I guess, Pantheon.
I can take a stab at that one. I think it's interesting. We get different pushback at different levels. When we show up at a big tech conference, like Oracle Code 1, there's those kinds of companies are still trying to figure out where blockchain fits in their world, the world of ERP applications and SQL databases. And to them, that's all about, cutting costs and being super efficient and making sure that it's not, it's easy to sort of onboard enterprises into this world versus, blockchain can be challenging at times for companies. So we often have to justify why blockchain fits into that mature enterprise stack. In the blockchain world, I wouldn't say there's pushback, but there's a lot of challenges and just there's so many moving parts. The Ethereum space is huge, and then there's other blockchains that are claiming to be sort of Ethereum killers. Then there's the enterprise blockchains or distributed ledger technologies. And so people are just always kind of asking like, well, why another, kind of like you asked, why another client? Well, why another blockchain? What are you doing different from everyone else? Because people have heard sort of the promise from so many different entities. They've heard the same promise from IBM. They've heard the same promise from, the Ethereum community, from Dfinity, Hashgraph, all these kinds of people. And I think just giving people a vision for, where we do fit in that world, I think is sort of our greatest challenge. And I guess what we're trying to sort of distill in our conversation today with you, if that makes any sense there.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So I guess, everybody was really excited about Pantheon at DevCon. Is there any, metrics or data you guys could share, based on downloads or uptake or anything? I know it's very early. I'm just kind of trying to gauge success following all of your hard work on Pantheon.
So you can go to our GitHub and see the number of stars and forks. And so it's early days, and for a very technical product, it'll take time to grow the community to the scale we want. But we're excited with the early traction. We've had a number of third-party people come check out and contribute to the open source project. We had Parity launch a new testnet called Gorley, and they went out of their way to make sure that Pantheon could interact with that testnet. And so we can see the community starting to form around the product, which is really exciting. On the private chain side, there's nothing we can share at this moment. We're starting to see a couple of enterprises play around with us, and we're hoping to see the big push when we launch our enterprise alpha in Q1 of next year. The other exciting bit is you can go to ETHStats, I think it's ethstats.net, whatever the URL is, and take a look at all the nodes running, and you'll have Pantheon nodes right up there with the other nodes operating on mainnet and running mainnet. So you can go and see that it's all there, working, syncing, processing, validating, and so forth.
That's interesting. So let's go back to the main Ethereum chain, because I know you guys are pretty active working on it, researching ETH 2.0 or Serenity or whatever you want to call it at this point. Is there anything, I'm just trying to understand the interaction between you guys and main Ethereum. Like, do you guys have to play a large role in influencing the future of Ethereum, or do you guys simply have to make sure that your new client is like up to date and able to interact with the main chain?
So I would say both, right? Ethereum is a community effort, and one of the reasons we're so bullish on Ethereum as a technology is because of how vibrant the technology is. So we don't need to play a large part. We want to contribute as much as possible, and we want to be a good player in the ecosystem. So that definitely means working with the foundation, the other client implementers, the other researchers, to make sure we can all make the technology as effective as possible. Ethereum is really just a specification in some sense that other teams then go and implement against. And so it's no good to just implement your own thing and not work with everyone else, because that leaves you alone and not benefiting from the community. That said, we are the largest protocol team to my knowledge. I mean, we're over 50 people right now, which gives us a lot of firepower and ability to invest in different areas and try to move the ball forward. So we have 10 people working on Ethereum 2.0. We've got people with the 1.x efforts, or the current chain improvements. We've got the sidechains research and other privacy research that I mentioned already, plus a large team of engineers implementing and improving Pantheon to make sure it's a fast-performant, enterprise-grade technology.
That's interesting. So I guess, it might be a little old at this point. Well, not old. I guess everything's relevant now, right? So the Ethereum 1.x came out after some somewhat private conversations, but now it's like live, and Ethereum 1.x is more for near-term improvements while we wait for Ethereum 2.0 and Serenity to fully come out. I mean, what's your guys' take on the state of the Ethereum community currently? Do you think that it's being fractured by all of these competing ideas, or do you think that these near-term improvements, while also focusing on the long-term goals of Serenity, is the way to go?
So I don't think it's ever been stronger. I would say quite the opposite of being fractured. The 1.x conversation, which I think we need to move away from calling it 1.x because it's basically just a bundle of separate improvements, came out of conversations with the research team and implementers that happened at DevCon to figure out how the current chain can improve and support some of the advanced research efforts. So this isn't a competitive advance to the 2.0 at all. It's entirely complementary in supporting their work. And I think it's really exciting to see the swarm of activity on both efforts that can keep ensuring that Ethereum is the cutting edge, most performant, most vibrant technology out there.
That's interesting. So I do have you guys for like 10 or 15 more minutes. I want to talk about Ethereum 2.0 and Serenity. But before we go on Is there anything about PegaSys or what you guys are working on that's interesting that I missed or that you want to discuss?
I think the only bit that we didn't mention at all that I think is worthy of highlighting is some of the standards efforts we do. So we have a team of standards experts who work with both the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, a little bit on Ethereum research, but as well as W3C and other international standards bodies to help codify what it means to be Enterprise Ethereum and blockchain. And the goal there is to create an ecosystem that is unified, where there's interoperability between software, interoperability between tooling, and make it so that it's one community rather than a series of balkanized, competing, siloed efforts. And so that's really important for us. It often goes unsung, those efforts, but it's been really effective thus far. And we've seen that with the EEA releasing its latest specification for NDEF and the groundswell momentum around there as well.
No, that's interesting. So I guess for those who aren't aware, I mean, how much of an influence does the Enterprise or the EEA have over Ethereum itself? Like, is this like a god here, or is this more of suggestions, or what exactly is the pull there?
Well, so the EEA is a community effort, right? It's a series of enterprises. They don't touch anything that is mainnet Ethereum yet. That's entirely the Ethereum Foundation's mandate to organize the community around that. Where the EEA steps in is all the additional layers that are needed to make enterprises use and engage with Ethereum. So that comes back to the 3 Ps we talked about earlier in the podcast. And so if you read the EEA spec, a lot of it covers privacy, permissioning, performance requirements, stability, and so on.
That's interesting. So let's go on to Ethereum and Serenity, because I think we're somewhat out of stuff to talk about PegaSys, which is a good thing at this point, right? But let's go on to Serenity. I mean, what are you guys most excited about with Serenity? I am extremely excited about it. I just posted a deep dive research report. I think I sent you guys it. It's on my site. Everybody can view it at 51pct.io. But I'm kind of trying to figure out, what drives, like use cases here. And I used games as kind of a proxy for whatever the next massive iteration will be. So I kind of looked at Gods Unchained and how that kind of advanced from CryptoKitties and how we're getting more complex and, better use cases on the main chain. So I guess, what are you guys most excited about here with Serenity or Ethereum 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, Serenity is the big effort. So there's a lot of different angles. You've been kind of hinting at that we're a very technical team. We have a lot of people with PhDs in mathematics and cryptography. And because of the attention blockchain and Ethereum too have been getting, you're seeing people who were leading in adjacent areas, like people who are leading cryptographers like in the world, like Dan Bonet or other people who were inventing cryptographic concepts, now actually talking to and holding workshops with people in the Ethereum 2.0 effort and the Serenity effort, and they're like actually pushing the envelope on things like how do you collect thousands of digital signatures and validate them really, really quickly. So we're not just pushing the envelope on blockchain technology, but on technology, cryptographic distributed systems technology overall. And I think that's really cool. And you could see some really interesting things come out of that. You could see contributions to other ecosystems or blockchain go in interesting ways. So that's the nerdy answer.
Faisal, you brought up a good point here, and what I'm trying to think through is like, we have so many blockchain developers, but there's obviously millions of developers around the world that have nothing to do with blockchain. But it seems like if you guys lower the barriers for enterprises to adopt it, you can get all of their blockchain researchers and developers kind of automatically. I mean, do you guys think that you're in some way opening the door for, the global developer base to get on blockchain and Ethereum, or am I thinking about that wrong?
I know, 100%. I think that's one of the things that we want to, like Dan said, one of the reasons we're writing it in Java is because you have all these Java developers out there, especially so we talked about financial services. They have engineering teams, and a lot of those guys are really good at big Java applications and distributed Java applications, and getting their interest. The people who are building Hadoop and all the big data applications, they're like senior Java ninjas, and we're just starting to see the trickle of interest from them into Pantheon and PegaSys stuff and the blockchain stuff, because there's so many interesting problems to solve. Blockchain can be a bit of a hornet's nest because there's, like you said, the cultural issues, the technical issues, but really smart people, I think, are fascinated by these problems. And I think drawing them towards these problems is going to yield some really interesting results.
That's interesting. So I guess on that point, I mean, is it hard to hire? I mean, you guys are a huge engineering and protocol team. And is it hard to hire blockchain developers, or is it easy for you guys to hire them?
It's definitely hard. So if you in the audience are listening and you find yourself as a performance Java expert with experience in high performance computation or distributed computing or cryptography or any of those fields, please reach out to us. We're always looking to chat. What Faisal said just now about people in adjacent fields coming in is sort of our hiring strategy as well. We look for experts in the neighboring and sort of component inputs into blockchain, and then try to leverage their experience, because there aren't people who are experienced enough at blockchain, and that's fine. But there are people who are world-class in databases or world-class in distributed systems or enterprise Java performance applications and things along those lines that we can work with and give them the environment to learn and pick up on blockchain paradigms while bringing their wealth of experience to the table.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, there's millions of developers around the world that have nothing to do with blockchain. I think people really need to talk about it more, that, what would happen if, a large percent of the world's developers start working on blockchain. I think it would be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the strength of Ethereum is in its community, but we're fundamentally in early days of the blockchain adoption curve. And so that community stands to grow significantly in the coming years.
That's interesting. So I guess to close out, I want to know what, the hardest things for you guys have been, or your concerns going forward. I mean, I know that you guys are focused on Ethereum, but I guess what are the biggest criticisms you guys have of Ethereum now or moving forward? Or are there any things in Serenity or 2.0 that you think just won't happen?
I think we'd probably hesitate to be too critical given how hard some of this stuff is. I think the challenge is sort of, it's the pro and the con, is that you have this huge community that's distributed across the world. People in Europe, in Hong Kong and Japan and South America who are all super excited about this, and getting them all on the same page and handling those communications and collaborations is an effort unto itself. I know Dan actually has been taking on some of the coordination stuff with 1.x, or what is formerly known as 1.x, and that itself has been a challenge. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to comment on that, but that's what I see as sort of one of the hurdles to clear, is just getting everyone on the same page and moving in the same direction.
So I was going to add a very different challenge, a very different sphere. I don't know if it does a disservice or a service to the technology that most people's first interaction with it is in cryptocurrencies. Blockchain is a very powerful set of technology and set of concepts. And the fact that with most enterprises, we need to spend the first 10 minutes of every meeting disassociating from the volatility of the public crypto markets, I think is an additional barrier to the adoption of the technology. I'm hoping we'll move beyond that in ways that I think the ecosystem has mostly moved beyond the idea that, crypto is for criminals, which was a problem in the early days as well. But I think there's a lot of branding and awareness issues that we still need to effectively overcome.
That's interesting. But Daniel, I mean, aren't you guys directly solving that problem? Because it seems to me like if you're helping businesses spin up private blockchains, they never have to worry about the price of Ethereum. The only time that they have to worry about it is, to pay gas fees to store state on chain, I'm guessing, which would be like instant at that point. It'd just be $1 cost, right?
So we see ourselves certainly as part of the solution to that problem, but the problem is a real one, and sort of that's why it takes a lot of work. So when you ask what the challenges are, like that's definitely one of the first questions we get from a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny because the first conversation you have will be like, "Well, we are enterprise Ethereum," so then they're like, "Oh, so I don't have to buy Ether to use your applications," and there's like a bit of relief. But then, as you progress and people, think more carefully about the applications of blockchain, they're like, wait a minute, actually, like currency is one of the best use cases for blockchain. Like that's what it was originally designed for. And then they realize, currency or near liquid assets or use cases like that make a lot of sense. And that those things make a lot of sense when they're large networks. And then you end up with use cases that look not too different from cryptocurrency. So it's a very kind of interesting and circular sort of pattern sometimes to these conversations.
That's interesting. So I guess just to close out, I mean, what's next on the timeline for you guys? I know you mentioned alpha, I think in 1Q19. Is that right?
Yep, that's the plan. It's actually a multi-stage sort of release plan for us. So in Q1, we're looking at a provisioned version with finality, so consensus algorithms that can produce, finalized transactions versus on mainnet and other places you can sometimes fork. And then I think we'll have another release soon after that one with more privacy features. So yeah, there's going to be multiple enterprise releases in the first half of 2019.
And just to zoom out on that, that's so anybody can take the Alpha protocol and run their own private chain with their own nodes, whether they be on-prem or in the cloud, and it offers them ability to interact with the main chain, the main Ethereum chain through your client. Is that right?
So the first half, yes, anyone will be able to grab it. It's open source. The tooling to get a private network working with the mainnet, there's some very preliminary structures, like hashing something and then sending it to the mainnet. But the sort of meaningful two-way interaction that Dan was talking about would be a later release. It's not going to come in these two.
Yeah, the interaction, the active interaction with mainnet is definitely part of this long-term vision and would require a stepwise improvement on private chain technologies that we're working on, as well as the increased scalability of the network of the mainnet to be viable. So in the short term, we're focusing on a core set of features that we know enterprises want to be able to deploy Ethereum technology as it stands in a private network.
Got it. And just to close out, I apologize for asking this again, but I'm just kind of somewhat confused here. So the current blockchains that you could spin up on at Microsoft Azure or AWS, their tools to interact with the main chain is obviously lacking, right? Because you guys are solving that. It seems to me at the end of our conversation, that's like the critical point you guys are trying to tackle.
So I think that is a critical point for sure. And it is pretty core to the thesis, the long-term thesis we have. But there's a few components that go into achieving that long-term thesis. And so I don't want to diminish some of the other incredible engineering achievements and incredible value we're providing to enterprises and say it's only about the interop back and forth. It's not exclusively about that, but we're really excited to drive towards that vision.
Awesome. That's super interesting. Well, Daniel and Faisal, where can people find out more about PegaSys and more about you guys?
Faisal, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just got
no worries.
Technical challenge. So you can get onto our website, pegasus.tech. We tweet a lot in Pegasus Eng, Pegasus ENG, and then our GitHub, for any developers listening, is the same, Pegasus Eng. And we're always we have a lot of channels to talk to people over chat, over different open source collaboration mechanisms. So I think it's pretty easy to approach us and in sort of any manner of interest.
Awesome. Well, guys, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate your time.
Tom, thanks so much. Really appreciate you here.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate and review the podcast to help other people find it, and visit 51pct.io to sign up for our retail offering before prices rise to access our entire library of actionable and extensive crypto research.